Hello and welcome back to Adventures in Miniature. Today we're going to be working on a Steel Guard Sniper Squad. Initially I thought this was going to be a fairly simple one, but I made some choices that I would later regret and it added a lot more work than I was expecting. But that's part of the learning process, and whilst it might be annoying to make mistakes, they're a great teacher, so it's always worth trying to overcome them rather than just starting again. Dust, I think, has done a really good job of characterizing all of the different factions and giving them a really distinctive look. The SSU faction has a very no-nonsense feel to it, where everything looks like it's been put together from sheer necessity. Where the Axis units have very clean lines and feel very efficient, the Allied units feel much more rounded and look like they were mass-produced in a rush based on a familiar traditional design. The SSU, on the other hand, feels very utilitarian. Right, so I started out with a base coat of grey because I thought this would give me a good base to work with for doing a winter camouflage scheme and allow me to transition into darker colours for the metallic parts. I was, however, spectacularly wrong about this, as it took quite a few coats of white to get anything close to a consistent layer. I think if I were to try something like this again, I would have been much better off to just undercoat the whole thing in white spray paint first and then go from there. So after disassembling the model as much as I dared and applying what felt like 20 coats of white paint, I put some homemade texture paste on the base to dry while I worked on the main body. I decided to go for a winter camouflage scheme, and after looking at some reference photos of Soviet-era camouflage, I settled on a relatively modern pattern that was mostly white with a few splashes of grey and green to simulate winter foliage. I think it's quite easy to get stuck in the idea of camouflage being a base layer with swirly patches of one colour or another, and that's it. The most common in my mind being the British DPM style, but I found that a lot of camouflage patterns are a lot more subtle. So my plan is to base the armoured components in white and then use a sponge to stipple on some green and grey later to help create a more organic feeling pattern. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Once the white was done, I used some Abaddon black to base any metal parts before I came to dry brush them later. These particular models have some very nice little features on them that I feel show how much thought has gone into making the model feel like a working machine that people are climbing in and out of on a regular basis. Things like the railings on the sides helps convey that, but also just little things like the searchlight being connected by a power cable and the tarp stored on the back make the whole thing feel used but not overly cluttered. I focused mainly on the arms, hip joints and parts of the sniper rifle for this. I actually really like the details on the shoulder joints as well, which help give a distinctive character to the units as a whole. After the black was on, I decided to use Xandu dust to paint up the main body of the rifle, storage container at the lower back, and what I can only describe as the crotch plate. I wanted the units to feel like there's some parts that were made specifically for that environment, and then other parts that were mass-produced to save costs. It also helped to add a little more colour to the model, as I thought it would be a bit boring if the whole thing was painted white with green bits. With the majority of the base colours blocked out, I came back to the metal parts with some lead belcher, which is my go-to colour for worn mechanical parts. I had debated whether or not to paint more of the mechanical parts in white to match the body, but after the nightmare that was painting the armor sections, I decided it would be better just to keep everything a uniform metallic colour and try to add some detail with washes later on. Using a torn off piece of kitchen sponge, I decided to try out my camouflage idea on the legs, as I figured these would be easier to fix if it went wrong. I started with a layer of ash grey from Army Painter, which is a really light grey that I thought would fit well. I dabbed this on in layers to build up the suggestion of a pattern, and then did a lighter part with Castilian Green from GW, which is a slightly lighter forest green than the Death Corps drab that I usually prefer. The end result came out fairly well, so I went ahead with my idea to use this on the rest of the model. After this, I used a dry brush to create a few areas of exposed metal along the edges of the armor plates to give it a bit more of a beaten up feel and make it feel like it had been used, before moving on to some washes. I used Nuln oil to build up layers of grime and oil around the mechanical parts, and later came back in with some sepia tone to add a hint of grease. I did the majority of the work on the legs before I reattached them to the body so that I could get into the details on the inside of the legs. Once the legs were reattached to the hip joints, it was time for my favourite step, which is of course weathering. While I was painting up the body, I had a bit of a mishap and broke off one of the arms, which was a bit of a mixed blessing. It meant that I could get into the shoulder joint and inside of the sniper rifle, which is really hard to get to if your model has already been assembled. However, now I have to find a way to get the arm back on without doing more damage. This was an opportunity for me to try pinning for the first time. Using a pin vise and some thin gauge wire, I first drilled a small hole into the shoulder joint and carefully into the arm where I wanted the two pieces to line up. Once the holes were deep enough to help support the wire, I used some super glue and accelerant to fix the wire in place. I used more wire than I needed so that I could have the option to cut it to length as needed. Once I had the length I wanted, I could put some super glue on the exposed wire and slot it into the shoulder joint. I didn't want to use the accelerant this time so that I could have a little more time to position the arm into a pose that I was happy with. With the arms in place, I could come in and finish dry brushing the metallic parts with more lead belcher. After this, I used some more Zandri dust to add some detail to the scopes before moving onto the tarps stored on the top of the model. I used some more Castilian green for this, my thinking behind this being that this might have been used to cover over the suit when the pilot is out of it. Moving on to finishing up the camouflage, using torn off pieces of sponge, I was able to stipple on the ash grey and Castilian green to break up the white. This ended up coming out quite well, and I think I'll be using it for future winter camouflage schemes. Next I got to move on to some dry brushing, starting with a light off-white colour to add some wear onto the tarp and other equipment. I've really been enjoying these models. They're very unique to look at and have a really nice feel to them. The decision to paint them white was a bit of a double-edged sword. I'm really happy with them, but my decision to base them in grey made life so much harder than it had to be. If I could do them again, I'd definitely have based them in white, which would have given me a much better base to work from and saved me a lot of time. So, lesson learned, choose your primers carefully. Once I had the cockpit covers painted up to match the body, I went back with some lead belcher to create some patches of exposed metal to the edges of the armour, using a torn up piece of sponge. Then, using the same technique, I went over again with the ever useful Typhus corrosion to help age the model a little bit more. I love adding these steps because they help you to tell a story with your model. After the stippling was complete, I used Nuln oil again to add some smears of grime and draw out the lines a little bit more. With lenses, I feel like it can be really hard to choose which colour to use. The temptation is always to go the edgelord route of red, but it just doesn't seem to be convincing to me. It does make the lenses pop much more, but I just can't imagine it on a real life machine. I went with Caliban green, which is a really dark, rich green from Games Workshop. It went on really nicely and felt much more fitting to the look I was going for. Time for some more washes, and this time I'm using Agrax Earthshade, which is another wash that I find myself using a great deal. My aim with this is to add some more dirt buildup onto the underside of the unit. It gives you a really good layer of earthy colour that in my mind looks like splashes of melted snow mixed with mud that's been kicked up onto the underside of the unit. After this, I used some Games Workshop sepia tone to add a bit of colour to the mechanical parts, especially around the shoulders. Something that I noticed way back when I used to work in a manure factory, which is every bit as glamorous as it sounds. I noticed that a lot of the lubricating grease used for the forklift trucks and farm equipment had more of a dark brown tone to it rather than just being black. So I try to add a hint of sepia or brown to a lot of mechanical elements like joints and hydraulics that would need lubricating to function properly. Some of the cockpit canopies have essentially a pair of binoculars integrated into them. With these, I painted them black to make a base for some lead belcher before doing the shrouds for the lenses. I took the opportunity to paint the lenses first so that I would be able to come in and clean up any overlap when I did the rest of the shroud. I chose to do the lenses in Mephiston red for one and then Caliban green for the other. My thoughts for this was that the two lenses might be used to see in different spectrums such as infrared and low light. While the lenses are drying, I took the opportunity to dry brush over the model and try to dirty it up some more. I'm a big fan of using off-white colors to add a quick and easy highlight. I used layers of Nuln oil to build up a suggestion of muzzle burn on the end of the rifle. I find myself coming back over and over again during my painting process to add layers of dry brushing and dirt and general weathering. For me, I find this gives me an opportunity to step away from those details and prevent myself from fixating on any specific areas too much. I can add a bit of dirt, then leave it alone, come back later and decide if I want to add more or not. I think it's quite important to step away from your work once in a while so that you can look on it with fresh eyes and see what's working and what you might want to add to. Back to the lenses, I used Xandri dust over the main shrouds. I did this mostly to tie them into the gun and other equipment bolted onto the armor. Then, using the sponge technique and some dry brushing, I added some weathering to match the rest of the model. With miniatures literally being miniature, there's a fine line to be trod with how much weathering to use and how exaggerated to make it. It's really up to you. As long as you're reasonably consistent with what you do, add as much or as little as you like. The model is pretty close to being finished now, and I'm going to add some extra texture to a few spots on the armor to feel like built up mud. It's been splashed up from moving through the snow-sodden earth. I used Rhinox hide to paint the straps holding down the tarp. I do love doing these little details. For some reason they're really satisfying. Rhinox hide is an extremely dark brown and it's sometimes hard to decide to use such a dark color, but I think it fits quite well with this detail. So at this point the models are done. I could put them on the shelf right now and be happy. However, there's something I've been wanting to try since I saw it, and I think the character of these miniatures will really fit with it, so we're going to give it a go. I'm going to try and add some camouflage netting to the models. I think this is a good opportunity to try it out on a small scale before I try and scale it up to something bigger. I'm going to make this by taking some cloth bandages and pulling them apart until I've got something I like, with enough gaps in it to keep it from looking like it's just a solid mass. Once I've got it to a point that I'm happy with, I mixed up some PVA glue and green paint, which I dunked the bandages in and then spread out on a baking tray to dry overnight. This came out a lot lighter than I thought it would, and I think I would have liked it to be a bit darker. However, that's why I'm doing this on a small scale, so I can learn from this experiment and use that knowledge for another project further down the line. Once the PVA glue had dried, I used some grey and brown to dry brush on a loose camouflage pattern onto the cloth. After cutting out some strips that I wanted to use, I then dipped them in some water to soften the glue a little before wrapping them around the rifle barrels. Initially I had wanted to use the camouflage netting on other areas of the armor, however I couldn't find a way to incorporate this into the model without just draping it over the whole thing. So I settled for just adding a little bit in order to break up the silhouette slightly. I think it came out okay, but not as well as I would have liked. Once the netting was in place and dried up again, I decided to add a little Death Corps drab to darken up some patches before coating it in some Mod Podge to protect the netting and seal it in a little more. Finally, I used some Retributor Gold to paint names onto the sides of the armor. I put out a post on the Dust official page looking for names, and the ones that took my fancy were Larry, Curly and Mo, which I threw into Google Translate to give me the bare bones Cyrillic translation, which was fun but not particularly essential. And with that, we're all done. These were a fun change for me, especially using white as a main color. I've learned some valuable lessons from this one, largely that I should have based in whites. If you like these models, you can head over to the Dust website to pick some up for yourselves. I hope you found this video entertaining and even useful. If you did, feel free to like, comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!